But so a question I always like to ask you guys, and you don't have to answer it now, just think about it as we walk to our first location. But I like to see what you guys think. Why do you think Mount Rushmore is located here in the middle of South Dakota of all places? So I'll have you think about that and we can head to our first stop.
This is the beginning of the walking tour of Mount Rushmore National Park. And our guide is Paige Hill, National Park Ranger.
No, I think because this place is, it's something to do with the president. It's very central to the United States. Yeah. It's like in the middle of the country. I think there's been a war.
So is this your first summer?
It is, yes.
Maybe because there's a lot of
Well,
South Dakota has been a friendly place.
yeah.
Can I pick it up?
Yeah, for sure. It's pretty much, yeah. Totally contrasting.
It's more friendly than the West too. I came from Oregon about 4.5 years ago.
Alright, so this will kind of be our first little stopping point. I'll maybe have everyone kind of scoot off to this side a little bit just so folks can get past us on the trail if they want to. Alright. So, to get started with our whole story, you have to go back, way back to the 1800s. 1870s, 1880s is when European settlement first started in this region. The main draws to this area were the gold rush and homesteading were pretty much the two main reasons people were coming out here to South Dakota to settle. It's also around that time period that Mount Rushmore got its name. It was named after this gentleman right here. His name is Charles Rushmore. And he was actually an attorney from New York who came out here in 1885 surveying for a mining company that he worked for. They purchased some claims out here, and so he came out to make sure they got what they paid for. And kind of as the story goes, he was just riding on horseback through this region with his guides. He looked up and saw a big mountain, and he asked them what the name of that mountain was, and they said, well, it doesn't really have a name, so we'll name it after you. And they might have been kidding when they said that, but then it did catch on with the locals. It was kind of unofficially known as Rushmore's Mountain up until it was officially dedicated as Mount Rushmore in the 1930s. So, name has nothing to do with the carving, just came with the mountain that they chose to carve, but kind of a fun story nonetheless. You know, when South Dakota's still getting established around this time, doesn't become a state till 1889, not a whole lot in the way of tourism really going on at that time. But then going into the late 1800s is when kind of the first tourist attraction sprang up in this region, and that was the town of Hot Springs, South Dakota, which is just about an hour south of here. And there are, as you may have guessed from the name, a lot of natural hot springs in that town. And so that kind of sprung up as a health resort town. People would go there, more wealthy people were the ones traveling around that time, but they would go there, soak in the hot springs for various health ailments they might have had. And so that's kind of how that town got its start. And then going into the early 1900s is when Wind Cave and Jewel Cave were first established. Those were actually privately owned to begin with. Families claimed those caves and would take tours down into them. A whole lot of legal battles going into how they got put under national park jurisdiction that I'm not going to get into. Kind of long and complex and boring. But just to give you an idea of kind of what the first tourist attractions were in this region. And so not a whole lot going on, but then going into the 1920s, something happened that kind of changed the face of tourism in America. Are there any guesses as to maybe what that invention was? Yeah, the automobile. The affordable automobile suddenly changed the face of tourism in America. Made it more affordable for people to travel, much easier for them as well. And so that was kind of the beginning of the American road trip. And so with that in mind, all the politicians out here in South Dakota really wanted to capitalize and draw those automobile tourists out here to South Dakota. And one man in particular that would eventually be involved in the creation of Mount Rushmore was a man by the name of Peter Norbeck. He was a governor of South Dakota and then eventually became a United States Senator. But it was him that helped to establish not only Custer State Park, but also Iron Mountain Road and the Needles Highway. Has anyone maybe driven those yet or are planning on it? Yeah, a couple of people probably planning on it later in the trip. Yeah, so For those that are not familiar, it's this red line on this map of the Black Hills that I'll be showing to you guys. And so Peter Norbeck, he first established Custer State Park in 1919, was South Dakota's first state park. Fun fact, also the reason that we have mountain goats in this region. They are actually not native to this area of South Dakota. Custer State Park in the 1930s had a zoo, and some mountain goats escaped from that zoo. And apparently no one ever did it. So, no mountain goats in this region. So pretty fun to see, even if they're not necessarily native. But then Peter Norbeck also is the one who designed the Needles Highway, which goes through what are known as the Needles of Custer State Park. They're these tall spires of granite, and the road winds right through them, so it does make for a very cool scenic drive as you go. And then later on, he established Iron Mountain Road when Mount Rushmore was being constructed. Very similar in that it's a very curvy, windy, scenic drive, but that one focuses on Mount Rushmore in that there are these tunnels blasted through the natural rock, and they frame Mount Rushmore in the distance as you're going through them. That makes for kind of a cool picture. But so anyways, with all this industry and new roads being constructed in the early 1920s, that gave one gentleman an idea. We'll talk about that at our next location.
Between that and the donkeys. The donkeys are.
I actually don't know how they got it. Is that
From
also?
what I've been told, the prospectors brought donkeys here as part of their, work
and I'm just gonna let them loose.
Yeah.
Today is Sunday, October 11th, 2020. And this particular tour might not be of particular significance for the history books, except for you may notice that many people are wearing masks.
So this kind of bench region is where we're staying at. So yeah. There. Want to sit down? Please feel free.
Quick question.
Yes.
Do you guys ever see any like goats on the mountain? Like by the
Occasionally
statue?
there will be mountain goats up there.
When my son was here from
Yeah.
Oregon, there was one on the top of Jefferson.
Oh,
and
is
he got
there?
a picture of it.
Oh my
That's pretty
gosh,
funny.
that's so funny.
Yeah, they're not always here, but sometimes they do up here. Actually, yesterday there was 2 moms and 2 babies like right up in this area hanging out. So maybe keep your eyes peeled if they're still. I'm not sure where they went after that.
Many people are wearing masks
All right,
because
so
of
back to that
COVID-19.
question that I asked at the beginning. Any guesses as to why you think Mount Rushmore is located here?
Because it's granite?
Yes, yep, because of the granite. And then the other half of that was just to increase tourism out here to South Dakota. It was the idea of this gentleman right here. His name's Doane Robinson. He was South Dakota's first state historian. So, early 1920s, he's recognizing that all these new roads are being built, all this industry is happening, but still not a whole lot of people are coming out here to South Dakota to visit, unless they're big nature lovers, because that was about all that South Dakota had to offer in the way of tourism at that time. And so Doane Robinson thinks that perhaps we need to give people a reason to come out here to South Dakota, and that maybe a large-scale carving somewhere here in the Black Hills region might be a good way to do that. And so his initial idea was to carve that Needles region of Custer State Park, because there's already a road going through there, and he figures with just a little bit of carving, these tall spires of granite could easily be made to resemble human figures. And who he was wanting to feature were actually Western figures. People like Chief Red Cloud, Lewis and Clark, Buffalo Bill Cody, all those sort of figures he thinks would be a good draw for this region. So to get this idea started, he contacted the artist of Mount Rushmore, Gutzon Borglum, to ask if he would be interested in coming out and doing a carving out here. And so Gutzon Borglum agrees, comes out in 1924 to take a look at that Needles region, see if that's a good location for a carving. Ultimately, and obviously, they decide against it. Gutzon Borglum feels that the Needles are too weathered, and by the time he gets all the rough exterior stone off, there's not going to be enough left for him to carve. Also, he feels that the Needles are too naturally beautiful and doesn't want to change that landscape. So it's probably for the best. There was a lot of public opposition to carving in that location. But so, because because of that, they need to find a new location, and so he comes back out to South Dakota in 1925 to try and find a new location, and ultimately they settle on Mount Rushmore. This is what Mount Rushmore looked like before it was carved, and he chose this mountain for three main reasons. The first is just that it was big enough for what they were envisioning. The second is it faces the southeast, so it gets the best and maximum amount of daylight throughout the day, good natural lighting for the sculpture. That was really important to get some Borglum. And then the third reason is it's made of a type of granite known as Harney Peak granite, which only erodes at a rate of about 1 inch every 10,000 years. So his creation would stick around for a while. You know, you're gonna put in all this effort, may as well make sure it can last. And then it was Gutzon Borglum who changed the idea that Robinson had from those Western figures to presidents, because he feels that if they're going to be doing something on this scale, this monumental, that the subject matter should kind of reflect that. And also, if the idea is to increase tourism to South Dakota, may as well pick figures that most everyone in the country can recognize. You know, not everyone's going to recognize those Western figures, but most people can at least recognize at least 1 or 2 presidents up there on the mountain. And so they have this idea, you know, mid-1920s, and while people are kind of interested in it, no one is really interested in paying for it. You know, some people are okay if it gets carved, but no one really wants to foot the bill for it. And so mid-1920s, this idea is kind of stalling. They're really not sure whether or not they're even going to get the funding to be able to start the project. And the thing that turns this all around is in 1927, President Calvin Coolidge came out to this region for his summer vacation. And so that was not by accident or random chance. It was actually the result of months of campaigning by all the state politicians of South Dakota, because they recognized that if the President of the United States came out here to South Dakota, that would be hundreds and thousands of dollars worth of advertising, more than they could ever hope to achieve on their own. And also those that were involved in the Mount Rushmore project hoped that perhaps President Coolidge would throw his support behind the project. And that is what ended up happening. President Coolidge attended the dedication ceremony of Mount Rushmore in August of 1927, and he gave a speech in which he vocalized his support for federal funding of the project, which in the end was pretty critical. It cost about $1 million to carve Mount Rushmore, and about 85% of that ends up coming from federal funds. So pretty crucial that President Coolidge threw his support behind it. It is hard to put that dollar amount into today's dollars, just because the carving period lasted 14 years, and you know, we've got the Great Depression right in the middle of that, so the value of the dollar really fluctuated. But estimates that I have seen put it by today's dollars anywhere between 14 to 17 billion dollars. So it was quite a bit of money back then to be spending on this project. But yeah, once they got the money to get started in 1927, they were finally able to begin carving, and we can talk about the carving era at our next location.
Look, a tour.
One thing you did not mention yet is only one of those carvings was controversial at the time, and that was Roosevelt.
Yes.
The rest of them there was no argument about.
Yes, that is very true.
I think
I mean,
it's,
unless someone objected to the carving in total, which some people did.
Sure.
I think Gutzon Borglum, he was the one who pushed to put Roosevelt on there.
Yep, he was the one who chose the presidents in the end. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about that. We can talk about that.
He was the only one that chose the presidents, or wasn't there a committee of some
It was
sort?
kind of the final
There was technically a committee, but in the end it was really him who got his way on.
If I'm
who
going
went.
to carve it off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was
I'm
his
gonna carve
artistic
who I
vision
want.
of what it was going to look like. So, in the end, he had the final say.
Roosevelt was the latest president. That's why he was the controversial one.
Yes.
And
Yep. Yep. 'Cause, yeah, people still remembered him on a personal level.
Never seen a teepee up here before.
Yeah. Your youth area.
no,
It's been closed for a little while. Alrighty, so we'll kind of stop in this little circular area here. Feel free to grab a bench if you'd like one.
I don't remember having come up here before. This must be since the 60s.
Oh, absolutely. Alrighty, so 1920. 1927, they have the funds to get started on the carving. They begin carving Washington's head. He is on the most prominent location on the mountain. And they pretty much carve one head at a time, though towards the end they are working on multiple heads at once. And so they start Washington 1927. His dedication ceremony is in 1930. So every time that they finished a head, they would have another dedication ceremony, kind of to remind people that the project's going on, hopefully regenerate public interest, and hopefully inspire people to donate money to the project. So they always had a big ceremony. They would hang a massive American flag over the face that was to be revealed. The flag was about 39 feet by 67 feet. Because those faces are about 60 feet tall on average, so it had to be quite a large flag to be able to cover that. That flag is still in our museum if you wanted to check that out. So Washington, dedicated July 4th, 1930. The next head to be dedicated on the mountain was Thomas Jefferson in 1936. He took so much longer than everyone else because when they first started carving him, they were actually carving him to, when we're looking at the mountain, to the left of Washington. And so, if we're looking at the mountain, our left, Washington's right. They've been carving him in that location for about 18 months before they unfortunately discovered a crack that was running deep in the mountain, running through where they were going to put Jefferson's face. They suspected also perhaps running into the back of Washington's head. So if they kept carving in that location, they risked not only losing what they were doing on Jefferson, but what they had already done on Washington. So ultimately, they had to make the decision to blast off what they'd already done of Jefferson and move him to the location that you currently see him. And even from there, it wasn't all smooth sailing. They found another crack, this one less severe. But so to combat that, they just had to turn Jefferson's head slightly to the left and tilt his chin up a little bit so that the crack would be running through his cheek and his lip rather than through his nose. The nose is the most sensitive part of those faces. There's less granite surrounding it to hold it in place. Next one to be dedicated was Lincoln, 1937, and then Roosevelt, 1939. The carving era does last till 1941. So even though the heads are dedicated, they're still working on some of the details, that sort of thing. And as I said, towards the end, working on multiple faces at once. And so throughout this whole carving era, people are always able to come and visit Mount Rushmore. They're not hiding it or preventing people from coming up. Quite the opposite. Again, they want people to come into this place, tell other people about it, spread the word, and hopefully increase funds for the project. And so people are always able to come visit Mount Rushmore. And I show this picture because in the background you can see a sign that says Guide Service to Mountaintop. And so they would take people up to the top of the mountain. Unfortunately, in this day, we cannot go to the top of the mountain. That is a restricted area. This path is as close as you can get to the mountain. But if it makes you feel better, I work here, and that's as close as I can get as well. So we're even. But so these early tourists, some of them would come away with a rather unique souvenir that I would like to tell you guys about. So I'm not going to get super into the details of exactly how they carved the mountain, because I feel our museum and our movie pretty well covers that. But I will talk about this one technique that they use called honeycomb. That's what this worker right here is doing. He is drilling horizontally into the mountain in short, shallow holes, all very close together. And this process, by doing this, that helps to weaken the surface stone so that then the workers can use a hammer and a wedge to break these chunks of honeycomb stone off the mountain. And that's how we would get the curves and the details of the president's faces without risking taking too much stone off as they might have with the dynamite. And so what the workers started doing is they would take a piece of this honeycomb stone and they would send it down to the base of the mountain where the tram house was, and the tram operator would hang a piece of the stone on a peg outside the house. And so when people would first come up, they'd see this piece of honeycomb stone and they'd ask him about it. And he would tell them, oh, that's a really rare piece of stone that one of the workers found up on the mountain, and I'm saving it for him. And so with their interest generated, they'd offer him a couple bucks for it, and he'd say, oh, no, I can't sell it to you. No, I'm saving it for one of the guys up there. So they'd up their price a little bit, and this would go back and forth until they reached the price he was satisfied with. And then he'd say, all right, I guess I'll take my chances with the guy up there, and I can sell it to you. And so they'd exchange their goods, go on their way, and then he would call to the top of the mountain and tell them to send another piece down. So they probably thought they were pulling the wool over the tourist's eyes just a little bit. And I suppose at the time they probably were. But if you think about it now, those are pretty valuable historical artifacts. So who won out in the end? I'll let you decide that. But anyways, so carving era, as I said, 1927 to 1941. Wraps up in 1941 mainly because of World War II. You know, America is not yet involved in the war, but it's already been going on in Europe for a couple of years. And so the federal government feels that they should probably start focusing their spending on defense rather than other projects. So they defund all non-essential projects, and that does include Mount Rushmore.
Really?
And also that's it. Oh yeah.
Were they planning on carving another face on there had World War II not happened? Or?
No, that's a good question. There was never planned for another face. They had planned to do more on the presidents that you currently see. The model that they took measurements from shows the presidents going down to the waist, actually. So most of them would have had a coat or hands, that sort of thing. So there was intended to be more detail. But yeah, a combination of factors. You know, the war got the project defunded, but then also 1941, the artist Gutzon Borglum, he ended up passing away as well. And so the combination of those effects just led Congress to declare the project finished as is. And how you see it today is how it was left on October 31st of 1941. Any questions about the carving era? Yeah.
Is that kind of a shirt on George Washington, but then it's kind of like left?
Yes, yeah, there is a bit of a shirt on George Washington because yeah, he was the first one that they started carving. They just had a little more time to do a little bit more detail on him. So he's certainly the most detailed of our presidents out there. Good observation. Any other questions about the carving era? Yeah.
So are they planning to put more carvings and more people, like more American people on here?
Good question. They're not planning to add anyone else to the mountain for a variety of reasons. The main one being they just can't. The rock up there is actually too flawed, so there's a lot of cracks, you know, on this side of the mountain right next to Washington. That crack is still there that made them move Jefferson. And then on the far side of Lincoln, there's a small canyon that runs behind the heads, and so the rock there is actually too thin. So if they just tried to carve it, it would break through. But a lot of other factors, you know, out of respect to Gutzon Borglum, another artist wasn't going to touch this mountain. It's already functioned as a national park for over 80 years. Yeah, right. So we kind of preserve it as is.
I have another question.
Sure.
How big is it actually?
That is a good question. So those faces, on average, are about 60 feet tall. So about as tall as a 6-story building. Tallest one is Abraham Lincoln at 66 feet tall. Shortest one is Theodore Roosevelt at 58 feet tall. From side to side, it's 185 feet. What are some other fun measurements? George Washington's nose is 21 feet long.